Good evening, President Ragland, members of the board, and Dr. Smith. Appreciate the opportunity tonight to talk more about our social emotional learning initiative and how it's promoting student success. Before we get into some of the information tonight, we kind of wanted to ground our thinking in really how we've been implementing social emotional learning and really in the beginning our culturally responsive PBIS. It's important to start small when we think about what this really big picture is we're trying to accomplish: equity and excellence for all of our students to ensure that they're successful throughout every stage of life. And that really doesn't happen overnight. These are small steps that we have to take to really achieve some of our bigger goals. So I think it's just really important, particularly when we share that timeline later, that we understand these pieces that really need to be in place in order for us to achieve this really big goal. So tonight, I'm going to share some information from the Educational Advisory Board. This is a national board that one of the things that they do is they survey superintendents in school districts around the country to see what kinds of things are concerns for them and get some ideas about what they're doing and how they're addressing those problems. They integrate that information with research on these topics and then provide this information through WebExes so that this information can be shared. So we wanted to share some of that information with you tonight and then talk about later where it lines up with the work that we're doing. So this is a slide that I think has a lot of meaning for those of us working in schools. Not a big fan of the quote, "It may not be our fault, but it is our problem." I don't think we see this as our problem. I think we see this as our responsibility to understand what's impacting the lives of our students so that we respond in a way that puts the right kinds of supports in place for students so that they can be successful. But you can see that in the interviews of other superintendents and school districts around the country that they're coping with some of the things that our students and families are also coping with. Effects of the Great Recession, which happened in the early 2000s, changes in family structure, increased academic pressures from testing, rise in mental health diagnoses, which really began around 2011, a decline in free play and physical activity as we take away that free time for our students to ensure some of the testing pressures that are there, increased addictions, and then excessive screen time. One of the items missing that we've talked about considerably, both in our schools and I believe here, are adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences are also significantly affecting our schools and our children and families. But I think it's important to note that when you look at everything that's on this slide, again, it's things that our families and our children, our students are coping with, but this is also a national issue, and really want to bring that to the attention because the Educational Advisory Board, again, interviewed superintendents around the country. So when you look, this was another question that was raised. Disruptive behavior is high on the priority list nationally. This is a national concern. And you can see on the list district leaders as far as the percent of student population exhibiting those severe behaviors in the classroom. You can see that percent may be a little bit smaller for administrators versus teachers. On the right-hand side, teachers' perceptions reveal a trend in those disruptive behaviors, so significantly fewer now, and you can see that currently there are more disruptive behaviors, or at least that perception is there for our teachers. And when you look at what the superintendent from Missouri says, these are behaviors that are occurring across demographic groups. It's not really isolated to students that are high risk or schools that we might traditionally think may have more challenges. This behavior disruptions are really occurring across demographic groups and across school systems. And again, I think that's one of the reasons Educational Advisory Board did this study.
Actually, Susan, if I may, because we're part of the Educational Advisory Board,
yes,
and that's a convening that happens once a year in DC. Mm-hmm. I believe I was present when that superintendent made that comment. Mm-hmm. These are superintendents, public, private, charter, or networks. And when EAB asked what's the number one issue that keeps you up at night, that was what every superintendent to a person said. Individuals with disruptive behavior that we're seeing that we've never seen before. And as I said, it cut across all social, economic, and also all different types of school districts, private, public.
Yeah, definitely isn't contained to one demographic at all. So, and you can just see that the number of increases in those disruptive behaviors. And because of those disruptive behaviors, you can see that the average time per week teachers spend on discipline is around an hour and a half, and the average instructional time per week lost to those disruptive behaviors about 2.5 hours. And when you look at the behaviors that are interfering with students' learning, both the student themselves and their classmates, you can see that physical violence is at one end, but then tantrums and oppositional defiance seems to be occurring most frequently. Secondly is the emotional disconnect or the under responsiveness, what we would really think about as disengagement. So really at the far end, you have two behaviors that are most significantly affecting learning, one being withdrawal, and then the second really disrupting the learning of other students. And so what are schools doing then to respond to this? So obviously the number one response would be to expand student support services, either counselors, psychologists, mental health support specialists, behavioral aides, or specialists. We've increased support in each of those areas. We actually, in the area of behavior, created positions, our social emotional learning specialists, our social emotional learning interventionists, and more recently our behavior technicians. We provide specific training to those groups to act and support our teachers and to support our students so that that learning can happen in the classroom, not just for the student, but also for their classmates. We also made an additional investment in our social emotional learning specialists and having them trained as behavior analysts. That has been really helpful for some of our classrooms that have students with more significant social, emotional, or even cognitive challenges. But one of the things we know for sure is that just increasing staffing in and of itself really isn't the solution for this problem. We have to put systems in place that prevent these behaviors from occurring. And you do that by understanding what the root cause of that disruption is. When you go back to all of those factors that are contributing to the students' loss of educational time, disruptive behavior, mental health issues. When you look at the social emotional learning framework that we have shared over the last 2 years, at the foundation of that has to do with relationships, kids feeling safe and connected at school, having opportunities for physical play in order to not only develop their self-regulation skills, their executive functioning skills, but to also just engage socially with others. Those are the kinds of things that help our system return to calm so that learning can happen. Yes.
In addition to school,
Yes.
Does their home life affect that?
Affect.
I mean, like what you were saying that, in order to calm them, and to address these issues, we have to provide, calm environment and social emotional at home as well as school, or just.
Well, I mean, obviously our reach isn't always into the home. Absolutely, it's a community response. And we, Kim McWilliams and Dr. Smith and I work with Resilient Evansville and have a community-wide effort in order to bring this to our homes and understand what resilience mean and how stress and adverse childhood experiences affect the development and the learning for our students.
How often does a Resilient Evansville meet?
We meet every 2 months. But there are monthly. The subcommittees within the group meet much more often.
And those are professionals?
Yes, from the mental health community. And Dr. Del Rio from the medical community, Vanderbilt County Health Department.
We have St. Vincent Deaconess involved.
PTAs?
We have folks that have expertise in mental health on this committee. And then as we continue to grow and expand, because this is really in its infancy, while that group has been meeting for about 3 years, the Resilient Evansville really is about, I guess from February to now about 4 months old.
And,
as is much of what we're talking about, we're still in our infancy.
And United Way is on that as well, as is Patricia Winesapple. And part of the work that they will be doing will be working more closely with families. And one of the projects which we're really excited about are some of the learning modules that will actually go into the communities. We'll use a train the trainer model to help other families and other organizations also share what resilience is and eventually adverse childhood experiences. So that is our community-wide effort in order to help our families understand what social emotional learning is and how we can best support our students.
Because there was questions upstate this last session about what social there are some parties that are not maybe in favor of this, and I'm concerned that we get in front of that information with our information,
Sure.
which is the good information.
And I think you're correct. Unfortunately, what we deal with a lot is misinformation or
Right.
lack of
Right.
information. Dr. Ken Ginsburg, so if folks in the audience or those listening on the radio recall that he was in February, he actually also heads up the Center for Parent and Teen. And you can go on their website and get a weekly newsletter on Thursday, which is incredibly beneficial. So, I mean, that is all part of community awareness and acknowledging that
Is
we
that
do
something that
need
can be
to.
shared forward then too? to the
Absolutely.
community?
He's agreed to return in 2020 as well as 2021.
So in thinking about staffing, I think that's one, and actually one of the reasons our committee originally met was to think about how we could bring additional resources to our students to address their mental health needs. And again, you're never going to have enough mental health professionals or counselors, psychologists, social workers if we're not preventing the problem. And again, this was part of the motivation we had for developing our social emotional learning framework and really researching the root cause of why these types of adverse childhood experiences or these stressors were really affecting our students' behavior and their learning. And we were able to put those systems in place by preventing that, both through what we do in our climate and culture and developing relationships with our students, and now through the social emotional learning curriculum. We can prevent many of these behaviors, their intensification, and again, make sure that our students all have opportunities to be successful throughout every stage of life. And so as part of the national conversation, EAB provided information around punishment as a common response to misbehavior. That would be one of the most natural sorts of thoughts of how we would respond when these misbehaviors or disruptive behaviors are increasing. So you can see that punishment in and of itself is a common response. Florida has the highest suspension rates in the United States. Missouri has the largest rate gap between Black and white students, and boys are suspended more than girls. Percent of our elementary teachers who say they withhold recess as a reward and rewards as forms of punishment. You can see those percentages across the bottom. But the punitive forms of discipline, obviously, that we have available: out of school suspensions, in-school suspensions, removal of privileges or rewards, and then also calling parents into school to pick up their child. Those would be just some typical consequences or responses to misbehaviors in school. So you would think then naturally that as the behavior and the disruptions have increased and that intensity has increased, that if we would just intensify our consequences or that punishment, then those behaviors would diminish. And the research is very clear that punishment in and of itself doesn't work. And the research shows that high levels of out-of-school suspensions are associated with declining academic achievement among non-suspended students. So really what happens there is as the school environment becomes more punitive, more critical, relationships then become less positive. Kids feel less safe at school, which then results in more disruptive behavior. So what we've tried to do is to have alternatives to taking away recess, because we know our kids need recess in order for that system to reset, the cortisol to get back to a level that allows them to focus and learn, develop their executive functions. So we want to make sure that that movement still happens. And we developed the CARES program in response to the need for in-school suspension. So when our students in 4th through 8th grade have a behavior that may have resulted in an out-of-school suspension, they go to our CARES program. They get their math instruction for the day, so we ensure that they're not falling behind in math. We have a licensed special education teacher there. And then we have our social emotional learning specialists who do restorative questions and work directly with those students to ensure that they never come back. We want them to return to their home school successfully. So we know that punishment by itself doesn't work. We still have consequences. Our students are still suspended. We still have students that unfortunately engage in unsafe behaviors, and expulsions do happen, or they do lose recess. But for the majority of our students, we're trying to respond in a proactive way, so that they learn to develop those self-regulation skills and we can prevent that behavior from occurring again. So here's what is suggested as far as the menu of options and how we can respond to the increase in disruptive behaviors. You'll notice at the far left is PBIS, and that really stands for Positive Behavior Interventions in Sports. We started this iteration of PBIS in 2012. We have a couple other iterations that were actually preceded it, but the most current iteration of PBIS in EVSC was actually culturally responsive PBIS, and we started that in about 2012, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the other sorts of initiatives or options, social emotional learning curriculum, using trauma-informed care really to address adverse childhood experiences, the uses of restorative justice, which we actually use restorative practices, and the RTI or MTSS framework. We started RTI at the same time we started PBIS, and we're just now evolving into our MTSS model, which is a much more greater integration of our social emotional learning work with our academic and our college and career readiness. Having those student support teams so that we're responding effectively when students struggle. Alternative placement, I would say our Harwood, AIS middle school and high school do an incredible job helping our students and putting mental health services in place for them so that they can be successful and return to their home school. And then we use climate surveys through Panorama and My School Survey to see how our schools are doing, just to make sure that we're measuring and we have some accountability for the work that we're doing and making sure that it has an impact. So when we started this presentation tonight about start small to go big, you can see we started in 2012 with our very first PBIS cohort, again with this iteration of PBIS. And in that cohort, we trained our schools that year. We trained about 12 of our elementary schools, and they implemented in 2013. So we spent an entire year planning and getting their schools ready, providing professional development, and then implemented. We did the same thing with cohort 2, an entire year of training, and then we rolled it out slowly into their schools in different phases. Schools were held accountable for only portions of the work as they were able to phase it in as far as thinking small in order to really get a full implementation. Once we had PBIS in place, we integrated restorative practices as one of the responses when our students had a behavior infraction. Restorative practices are critical to developing self-awareness, social perspective taking, and emotional self-regulation. That ability to have some distance from the event, process what happened, process how it impacted others, and really take into consideration what the student might do to correct that mistake is huge. We do restorative practices. Most of the time, our students also have a consequence with the restorative practice, but the restorative practice is the learning and the self-regulation part of the whole process.
So what would be examples, like a couple examples of restorative practice?
So restorative practice,
going into the restorative justice.
well, so restorative justice actually is for prisons. That's where restorative justice start. Schools do restorative practices, and really after any infraction, it could be running in the hallway, it could be a fight, it could be pushing somebody down at the playground. You're going to sit down with the student once they get to calm. The more distance that students have from the event, better it is for their ability to process more negative emotions. So we sometimes associate that with they're not ready to talk, and really they're not ready to learn yet, because talking about negative emotions is hard. Nobody really likes to do it. So in restorative practices, we ask 5 questions. Tell me what happened. Tell me how it affected others. Tell me what you were thinking at the time. How are you thinking about what happened now? And then what can you do to correct the situation? So we don't give students the answers. We don't have an expectation that they want to go say thank you or I'm sorry. Like that, we want them to really think about what they would do to correct it. And typically they'll want us to tell the other person that they're sorry. But the idea is that they're reflecting on what they did, which is the self-awareness piece. Then they're reflecting on how their actions affected the other person, which develops social perspective taking skills. And then they're thinking about how to fix it. So in all of that, you're managing your emotions because you're talking about something negative, and you're also expanding your emotional literacy because you have to talk about how it felt for you and how it felt for them.
And the student goes and does the fixing.
Well, whatever their solution may be. A lot of times it's to write a note, but when we have little people, that push each other down in the playground, they'll say they're sorry, and they'll be friends and they'll go on and play.
But the teacher, this is as well as if there's a teacher involved or
A staff person.
a staff person or a student, but, or just among students, but the restorative practice is to go through this 5-part series that culminates in some action,
Potentially, yes.
potentially, but not
Yeah.
always.
We don't give them the answer. Sometimes they might say, I don't think I have to do anything to fix it. That's part of the learning,
okay.
right? It is, because we're not trying to tell them what to do. The idea is that the restorative practice is a learning opportunity for them, learning to develop the self-regulation, really learning to stop and reflect. What they're used to is somebody telling them that what they did is bad and wrong and this is what they should do. That's not any different than in a math class. If you answered 4 + 4 is 9, I said, no, that's 8. If I give you the answer every time and you never do the thinking, you're never going to develop your own self-regulation skills. So it's not about getting the right or wrong answer. It's about going through the thinking and then really being reflective about it. So it's
Susan,
critical.
If I may, here's where I think a lot of misunderstanding or misconception. So there is the opportunity to learn from this experience, because I think we all want to learn from the experiences, but there still is a consequence. And the consequence is not
Yes.
writing the note.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And I think so many times people get that confused, and then they
Correct.
continue to spread that.
Correct.
That's not the case. That is someone that is misinformed or not informed at all.
Correct.
There is the opportunity to learn through restorative practices, and then the consequence also occurs.
Which
Correct.
is,
Well,
So-
it's depending really upon the severity of what happened.
Yep.
So, and
So for our student at CARES, if they engaged in a behavior at school that resulted in a discipline infraction, instead of the students going home, which doesn't really prevent the behavior from occurring again, it doesn't increase their likelihood of school success, they go to CARES for 2 days. And in those 2 days, they get all of their math instruction. It's the one subject that kids fall behind the fastest, because it's, you can miss a really critical lesson and never catch up when you get back. So we have a licensed teacher that keeps the kids caught up on their math, catches up on any other homework, so when they go back, they're ready to start off on a fresh foot. So, but they're out of school for 2 days, and they're out.
that's the consequence. So the consequence would be going to CARES for 2 days.
Yes. And while they're at CARES, we do social emotional learning lessons with them, and we do the restorative practices. Students that come back more than one time, which only about 25% of our students return more than once, then our social emotional learning specialist begins to see what else is going on and what else we can do to support the student. So we work with our school counselors, we work with our school social workers, our assistant principals and teachers, and if we need to, we'll involve the family and other outside mental health services. So it's a really great way to be preventative and proactive, so that not only does the student learn, but those behaviors aren't continuing in the classroom. And that's an evidence-based response. But it's important to note that we integrated it with PBIS. It wasn't a new initiative. These are, when we talk about start small to go big, we started PBIS, then we layered in restorative practices. Then we talked about what trauma-informed schools were and the kinds of things that we needed in place for trauma-informed schools. Then we introduced our GAIN framework around social-emotional learning. And we spent 2 years there on our adult-to-adult learning, just developing those mindsets. We integrated those practices with our vision for teaching and learning. And just this school year, that we introduced curriculum in our kindergarten and first grade classroom. So all of that it's really important that even though it sounds like we're doing a lot of things, we started in 2012 and it'll be 2019, 2020 next year. So that's 7 years that we've spent really implementing this. Yes. Sorry, Chris.
I'd say we spent 3 to 4 years of that researching and developing, because unfortunately there are not many entities out there that we can go and replicate something. I want to go back a little bit to restorative practices.
Sure.
During my tenure as assistant principal or principal, there would be students that would love to be suspended out of school because it'd be a vacation. So when you think a consequence for them is going to CARES, I hate to overgeneralize this, but there were staff members that would send a student down to the office and they wanted that student to learn something, okay, and to improve. There were some staff members, fortunately in the minority, that just wanted the student punished. Well, if we're just simply into punishment in our society, we can continue to build more jails. But I think fundamentally that's not working. We have to make certain that we give folks an opportunity to learn along with the consequences.
I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, and kind of as a follow-up to that, and that was my question, how long does it take to fully implement something? I mean, we've had this shift in discipline for hundreds of years. How long does it take to have a complete paradigm shift, if you will, to this becomes the new normal for the teacher? How many years? Is there data? Does it take 10, 12, 15? I mean, how long does it typically take for us to be able to see that?
I would say from an implementation standpoint, we think of this in 5-year iterations. And I'll show you on the next slide that we're at a point where our PBIS is in place with fidelity in our school-wide settings. So I think those kinds of pieces are really important. Now we'll move into the classroom, and what does it look like to be in place in the classroom with fidelity? And what does it look like for us to make sure that we're supporting teachers so to the best of our ability so that their work can continue and our students can thrive? So we chunk that work, and we're very thoughtful about how that work happens because teachers have a lot on their plates. We can't push all of this in at one time. Number one, it's just not possible from a work capacity standpoint, but from a cognitive standpoint, in order for us to really integrate that new information, I need a little bit, and then I need to take it back to my classroom and see how that goes, right? I need to be able to understand what that concept means, then the next, and then the next. And we tried to do that with the GAIN framework and our learning, or SEL competencies or professional development. We did 4, and we wanted those paced out so that teachers didn't have to do anything differently. They could just think differently. So I would say 5 years is about how long it's taken us for PBIS to be in place with fidelity, and I think it'll be 5 to 7. We're trying to be really thoughtful about giving teachers, again, that cognitive space to
5 to 7 additional years.
Well, we're in year 3.
We're in, right.
Yeah,
Year
we're in
3
year
is the
3.
second.
We did 2 years of adult learning and then 1 year of this past year of the curriculum. So,
Interestingly enough, this is not the first time the questions come up, and it's one that perhaps I've asked a few times. But I want to just add a few things, I think, because here's I think the dichotomy of what we experience so often. First of all, research is pretty replete that outstanding teachers have done this for a long, long time. Yeah. So if I said, Susan, I want classrooms that look like they have structure, that look like they have routines, that look like they have high expectations, what did I just describe? PBIS. So it's interesting that that's what is the essence of PBIS, but for some reason, and I will say in our own district, it was messaged from the onset in earlier iterations. And then, unfortunately, I think a lot of it was done out of compliance. Once teachers understand the why, and you can operate from that perspective, then I think amazing things can happen. So, Chris, really to your point, and then Ann, to your point, we're really talking about how long does it take to change mindsets of adults who are not trained this way. Yeah. Most of the adults probably were like me growing up. I was blessed to have a pretty normal childhood, and then I interacted with students how folks and adults interacted with me. Well, there's plenty of research that will show you that the brain of the adolescents today and actually of adults today is fundamentally different than what we had 5, 10, 15 years ago. And when you saw, and I agree with you completely, Susan, when it said it's not our fault, but it's our problem, it's not our fault, but it's our responsibility. So all of those influences really do wire the brain differently. And they're through neuroimaging and neuroscans, you can see brains are different today than they were before. So then I would put forward to anybody working with kids, if this is not the solution, and I understand we're at our infancy, then tell me what is. Okay? Because, I'm sorry. No. I would love for us to say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're going to be fully implemented and things are going to be great. But the reality is there's always going to be an exception. The reality is universities do not teach this at all. So every single person that comes into EVSC has to learn this from scratch, in addition to everything else that we're expecting our teachers to do, which can be, frankly, overwhelming. Okay. So Mindset first, and when you get mindset, then behaviors will follow.
But implementation of practice is a concern, having been a boot on the ground, so to speak, with the restorative practices. Because when a student goes to the office for calming or is taken by a supervisor for calming and then comes back to the classroom with no explanation, takes a seat and just goes on, there's not much, the teacher, the person in charge of that room is not seeing or experiencing what that restorative process looked like. And I don't know how you do that because it's a class, you've got, send a report to the class. Even if it was a note that students would bring down, so this is what happened, and he is or she is going to apologize, because when they come back after having done a calming process, and I've been in these experiences, you've got a child walks back in the room and you're not seeing the restorative practice at the time. And nobody else in the classroom has either, which is a problem.
And so to address that, I think it goes back to what Dr. Smith said about mindsets. If we understand, why the initial behavior happened and what that student needs in order for learning to continue, then that process does feel complete. And what we really want is that once students, have had the consequence, restorative practice, and have returned to calm, that they're also returning to learning and that they're also returning to their school community in that classroom so that they stay connected. That relationship is foundational to that learning continuing and for the student, actually for that behavior to be prevented from happening again. So what I would say to that end is that still comes back on us from a professional development standpoint, so everybody understands the importance of that process. Sometimes students aren't ready to return to learning, and those are the kinds of things that we have to take into consideration before they return to class.
I'm just not saying return to learning, and I very much support social emotional learning. And having just extensive experience as an amateur, granted, but I support that. But there is an issue where nobody else in that classroom, the children, do not know what the restorative practice has been. And the teacher may know because the teacher may be inculcated into the school, but the substitute teachers do not know. And that is a bit of a concern because you're not sure what you're dealing with because you don't know.
And again, I'm still going to go back to the idea that it's a mindset. So when you look at the slide that says that in schools that rely more on punishment, that achievement is lower, attendance is lower, and engagement is lower. The reason for that is students in that class, as long as they feel safe and they understand what is happening, then they actually feel more connected and more engaged. And so I think I think that's the shift, right? That's the real shift that happens. This conversation that you're having right here is what we have to help folks understand what kids need in order to develop self-regulation skills. And sometimes a consequence where they're out of the classroom for an extended period of time has to happen, but that's when they've been unsafe or when they can't get to calm and return to learning. So, yeah.
Well, I've been wanting to have public, community discussions on that. We'll get there.
Sure.
Because I still just don't know how the children who were on either side of whatever incident might happen are being calmed.
Yeah,
But,
a couple things I think to add to that. If you are in a middle school or high school with those being rotational classes, if you will, then a student would probably miss the balance of that class. If you're in an elementary school, especially in the lower grades where there's not a rotation and it's grouped primarily by homeroom and you stay with that class all day, then I think that is more prone, I think, to have those concerns. So number one, communication is key, but I would also suggest, because I've been around for a while, even when there was corporal punishment, you wouldn't necessarily know when the student returned to class what the consequence was. So I want to go back to what Susan said earlier. Those classrooms or schools or settings where punishment is the norm without the opportunity to learn from your behaviors typically are ruled by fear. And that research will tell you that that is not a good learning environment for anyone.
Particularly with the stress load our students are bringing into our schools today. If we go back to slide 2 and talk about all of the kinds of things that are impacting our students' learning, it is significant. And we do have to understand how at the root that interferes with just behavior, social emotional learning, and their ability to be a good classmate. So, so I just wanted to end today with looking at our ranking in comparison to other similarly sized districts. At the bottom, what we have is our SET percentage, and that SET score really reflects the fidelity with which we've implemented PBIS in our school-wide setting. So what you can notice is that in 2013, which was the first year that we evaluated fidelity of implementation, yes?
This ranking, by the way, is academic success.
Yes.
Just so that you know, it's not a ranking of anything
PBIS.
other than
Correct.
academic success.
Correct. So you can see in 2013, of the 17 schools that received a SET, only 24% were implementing PBIS with fidelity. So as we go into 2014 and we add additional schools, so now we're at 35 schools, you can see only 46% were implementing PBIS with fidelity. Year 3, 64%. The next year, 68%. In 2017, the number declined, but that's because we changed how we measured and evaluated fidelity of implementation. We relied more on the practices of teachers. And then this is our score this year. So of the 38 schools that received an evaluation this year, 84% were implementing PBIS with fidelity. And you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, right? And our school ranking increases. So it has significant impacts in our climate and culture and learning, but it also takes time to implement. So
We're increasing, they're not going down, right?
correct.
Yeah, in other words, our academic success with peer corporations, we're the only one moving up. And also, this is school-wide.
Correct. These are
We're
school-wide.
not yet into the classroom basis, which is where I think you will see tremendous gains and greater teacher understanding, I think.
Correct.
And I don't fault our teachers at all. This is a foreign language to them. They're not trained this in their pre-teacher
Are any other
training.
universities starting this now?
We do have a local university, I think, that is coming to training this summer, not necessarily for PBIS, but I think they're starting to see that there is perhaps a better way.
So a local, but like
Yes.
Ginsburg across the country, I mean, they're trying to get this.
Yeah.
Thank you.